Hello, I recently finished watching season 2 of Poker Face on Peacock, and I wanted to just take a video to kind of give a series review slash overview to those either interested in the show itself or my thoughts on it. So, yeah, let's dive straight into this. So, to those unfamiliar, Poker Face was originally released in 2023 on Peacock by Rian Johnson, most known for Knives Out, Looper, and Star Wars The Last Jedi. It's a show that I've been meaning to watch for a while, but I just haven't had the time to because I didn't have a Peacock subscription. And then I was able to get my hands on like a week long trial. So, in order to avoid paying any more fees than I must, I binged the entire show in a week. I want to say that now because there's going to be a lot of opinions I give that may be skewed because of how I end up watching it. But I digress. So, to kind of explain how Poker Face works, we kind of have to go to its main lead, Charlie, who is played by Natasha Lyonne. Charlie is what she'd call a human lie detector. She's able to tell if someone's lying just by instinct alone. And because of that, it leads her to kind of knowing the truth about people and sniffing out a lot of, trouble and whatnot. And so, because of this, she usually ends up in these random murder cases, just happens to be nearby when all this has happened. And due to her good nature, she always tries to sniff it out and see, what's the real story behind this. Because she kind of embodies three different things that I like to joke about in my head. She has the spirit of Columbo. She has the personality of every cool aunt you know. And she has the persistence of a Karen. That is a deadly combination for anybody, and I mean anybody. So, yeah, typically how the show works is that the first 10 or so minutes are all about the context behind the murder. Who's getting killed and why. And, it kind of sets off all these Chekhov's guns that Charlie will eventually come across in the story. And then once the actual murder is committed, it just pops back to her, who is already in the area for some inexplicable reason. She just has a bit of a magnet to this sort of chaos. And so she basically spends most of the episode communicating with the people involved in the murder or case. It also kind of goes back in time to before as well, so she's kind of there before it happens as well. But she spends most of the episode just trying to figure it out by all these crazy clues that come out of nowhere. And it's a very fun and enjoyable time. I think some of the things this show tries to embody, I mentioned Charlie being Columbo earlier. That is essentially what this show tries to mimic in its formula, where it has a lot of episodic, it's an episodic format, meaning it changes settings, characters each episode. And like Columbo, and I guess if I had to name a more random examples, the Scooby-Doo movies, they try to have a guest star every episode. So they'll have a random celebrity who normally is the killer, to be honest, but that's not a bad thing at all. They make it apparent in the first 10 or so minutes who does what, so it's less of a mystery and more of a how is Charlie going to unravel this web of lies. And some of the guests can really range in popularity. Generally speaking, though, you're going to find at least a few or so actors or actresses you're familiar with, and it's a very nice thing to see. Ooh, I know this person. What hijinks are they going to get up to in this episode? I do enjoy the guests of the week. It's personally, I'm a little indifferent to it at some parts, simply because I will be the first to admit I am not completely in tune with movies, TV, and media at large. So there's going to be a lot of guest appearances I just overlook and miss. But if you're more into media, into pop culture at large, you're probably going to get a lot more out of this than I ever could. So yeah, no. I think I've explained Charlie. I've explained the general setup. Let's just go to the general pros and cons. So to start with the good, this is a really funny show. The show does a great job balancing its comedy, and by extension, its suspensefulness and seriousness. The show is overall lighthearted in tone, but it's not afraid to tell you when something is serious. And that's because the comedy itself isn't really spectacular in its execution. I mean that in the sense of it doesn't try to do anything completely bombastic 24/7. Or when it does, it feels tonally connected or seems like the next kind of the next step in whatever the plot is trying to display. It's a very well-written show in that regard, and it's able to keep the suspense high, partially because, as the stakes get higher, Charlie is leading herself more into the lion's den. And sometimes revelations come up after the fact. Like maybe another person turns out dead, or maybe there's just a random third party who interjects themselves into the entire case at large, making things even more complicated. So it just gives more for Charlie to juggle with, and it's very, very fun to just watch. And I think exclusively for season one, I'm going to mention this here. I like how it really does this episodic format. See, the general premise of the first season is that Charlie accidentally causes trouble for a mob, and this entire season they're after her. Okay, that's not really much of a spoiler. That's something you get from the first episode, and so on and so forth. And so, because of that, she's on the run and travels to a lot of unique locale. Like she basically goes, I wouldn't say globetrotting, but cross country. One episode she's in Florida, another she's in the Rockies, in Texas. She goes all over the country, and it's a lot of fun to see the unique scenarios caused by this. So, yeah, no, this is a really good show. Unfortunately, nothing's perfect, so I have to go over the cons. So, this is more of a general problem. The endings can feel a little subpar. They either don't end off on the best note, or they can just feel a little shoved in at times. Like, oh, wait, we got to end this, even though the episode length is very inconsistent across the board. It ranges from 40 minutes to technically 50 minutes on average, but Wikipedia will tell you 60 because of the premiere. So it can vary. Like some endings just do not end on what I call it a fun note. It just ends off on a stinker, which isn't the worst thing ever. Sometimes some of the plots can't really enforce that sort of gotcha moment. But believe me, when the gotcha moments are there at the end, they are hilarious. I'm not going to name any examples because I believe you, the viewer, should watch the show. But I'll save that more for the end. But when these endings are not impressive, they are not impressive at all. Sometimes this can go for the beginnings as well, and I think strong starts always needed. But I definitely have noticed a pattern of more subpar endings than subpar beginnings. And then my other major con with this show is what I'd like to jokingly call Indiana Jones syndrome, which I'll just put in parentheses here. Fleshing out Charlie doesn't really work. So what I mean by this, Indiana Jones, it's a movie series all about adventuring, but if you notice, especially in the 21st century entries, they love trying to make a storyline to kind of have Indiana Jones develop, and it normally doesn't work. Sometimes the writing itself is fine at points. It's just it feels kind of out of place and doesn't really work for what they're going for. It's present in every single movie to some degree. Raiders, Marion and his unexplained relationship, which you have to read, side material for, which I don't think should be the answer. Temple of Doom, Indiana Jones technically goes on an arc from being more greedy to more altruistic, but that's so subtle you forget it. I know a lot of people like The Last Crusade for how it balances his, problems with his dad. But I definitely do think there's some, a little bit of trouble balancing that at times. But the point I'm trying to make here is that trying to flesh out these characters, which are stuck in these episodic sort of forms, can be a very tough, challenging act. And I think Poker Face fails every single time it tries to flesh out Charlie. Because Charlie herself is a static character. She doesn't necessarily change, much like Indiana Jones. He is the same dude every time. He sees the wrath of God in the first movie and doesn't automatically believe in religion after that. Charlie, her entire premise off the first episode is that someone close to her gets killed, and then that friend is barely mentioned at all from there, and she's otherwise a very happy-go-lucky character. It doesn't really work, and I do appreciate some of the stuff they try to do, to either say, oh, she's really hooked onto this weird game of cat and mouse. And in season 2, she's a bit of a kind of a drifter, lost. I wouldn't say lost spirit, but she's kind of just looking for purpose more in the second season. But she's still otherwise the same person at heart, and they don't really do a good job of showing any sort of growth or even implying that she's changed at all. And that's like my biggest major problem with this show so far. But with that in mind, it doesn't really take away much from the episodes at large. It just kind of puts a couple of black marks on what I think are otherwise really fun episodes that go back to back, which I will say this. I don't want to talk about how I'd rank all the episodes, but because of how they do characterization, that's kind of why I don't like. I kind of think the first episode is one of the lesser ones. Granted, that's also a good thing in a way. I think a show is much better if the first episode is kind of on the lower end, because that just means it only gets better from there. But much like Indiana Jones, trying to flesh this character out normally just doesn't work, and each time they do, they usually default to a status quo. And then some other cons I have, which are for season 2 only, because to be truthful, I think season 2 is a noticeable step down in quality. I think season 2 itself is about on the same tier, and when I explain my ranking, this part will make more sense. But I think what makes season 2 kind of a bit more on the questionable side is that it does quite a few things. Like it still has some of the problems season 1 has with the subpar endings. Charlie, it's what I think is the show's failure of trying to develop Charlie. I think season 2 has its own cons. Like, for example, they usually make the setup more drawn out, specifically when it cuts to Charlie after the murder. Typically in season 1, after the murder's committed, it just pans to Charlie, who's already on the scene in whatever role she's in, because she's on the run and needs money. So she's like, one minute she's a convenience store worker, or another she's just out cooking on a barbecue, and you don't really need much context for that. But in season 2, it takes like a few minutes for her to really do anything relevant to the plot, because they introduce a few characters who either kind of slow her from getting to the plot, or just they feel the need to explain why she's there. And you don't really need a reason. Charlie's just Charlie. She goes where she wants and does what she wants. It doesn't really need much more than that. As well, the locations in season 2 are more static. Charlie is stuck in the same few locations throughout season 2. And while they're not inherently bad, it definitely takes away what I believe to be one of season 1's biggest strengths, is just seeing the world at large and all the types of wacky scenarios you can get to on one part of the globe that you otherwise could on the other. Or at least America, excuse me. Again, she doesn't go out of the country. But, she's stuck in one part of America for a good third to a fourth of, or maybe even a half if my memory is that hazy enough, of season 2. And because of that, you still get some novel settings where these murders can happen, but it feels like less impressive. It feels like the world is smaller when this all can happen in one area, especially where the specific setting it is, which, if you've seen any movie or heard any sort of stereotype about this place, it's like, yeah, no, of course crime's gonna happen. It doesn't feel fantastical or really speaks to the world at large. It just feels generic by comparison. Also, Charlie just interacts less with the cast of the week in season 2. Like, I noticed she just doesn't have as many interactions with some of the characters. And again, that's what made season 1 so much fun, is that she's always talking to someone new, and she builds a genuine rapport, and you can see her becoming invested in this case, which she doesn't always have to, obviously. And season 1 does do that a few times, but it makes less sense when she starts unraveling everything, because she doesn't always see the testimony right away. She kind of just starts picking up pieces bit by bit from everyone. But this is like, she sees one person and that's it. She doesn't really interact with the killer as much. She usually only talks with the person who ends up getting killed. It's weird. And then lastly, for season 2, the new reoccurring characters aren't good. Despite the episodic format, Poker Face generally has a revolving door cast, but there are a couple people who end up showing up a few times throughout. The ones introduced in season 1, I think, are fun. And whether they're brief or they at least have outstanding qualities that make them memorable. I cannot really say the same for the main 2 characters who Charlie interacts with the most in season 2. Because one of them is kind of just stuck being talked to through radio at the beginning and end of each episode. And I'm going to be honest, I don't find them that funny or anything like that. And then the other character who they introduced towards the end, I think is very weirdly written because this character is very normal and they just overall do not fit into the world at large of Poker Face. Not to say that they have to be some evil mustache twirling villain or have the charisma of like, just the charisma of every theater kid but they just stand out like a sore thumb. They don't really feel entertaining for the most part. If you've seen Poker Face, you hopefully know who I'm talking about. There's a lot to say about that character, but generally up until that point, I just don't think they're that enjoyable, and they take away from the show at large and the mysteries. So you would think that I dislike the heck out of season 2, but no, I still think it's great. I just can notice the cracks a lot easier. And again, I watched this entire show in 1 week. If you watch any of those videos that are like, I binged every single episode of this show, the commentator almost always says that things get worse as things go on. It's not just because of a drop in quality. It's because when you're watching that many episodes back to back, you're just going to get sick of watching it in the first place. So I just say that to stress that these cons are noticeable, but they overall do not make me think the show is gone for good. It also, for the fun fact, since season 2 is released in 2025, Rian Johnson has also been working on the new Knives Out movie, Wake Up Dead Man, meaning his involvement on season 2 is less pronounced, though granted he only directed a handful of episodes to begin with. It just means that this isn't his biggest priority, so I don't want to say quality control's out of control, because that's a bit mean to the writers and directors who, they made a lot of fun episodes, but like it clearly isn't his top priority, and he has his hands tied. So that could be another thing, but at that point I'm just speculating. So yeah, I think what I want for the show to do going forward is keep the change in location, keep changing locations, do whatever to make it more unique. Try and get better with the endings. Please, please, please. Some of these endings really just end on a really flat note. And it's a shame because the rest of the episode can be excellent otherwise. I don't want to say they should stop fleshing out Charlie, but if they're going to flesh it out, they need to kind of be more committed to it in her writing. And I think my cons have made it pretty obvious what I'd like to change. Is there anything I'd like to add that I didn't mention? No, not really. I just want good television, and this is great television. If I were to rate both of these seasons, they are both 8 out of 10s, but going in different directions. Season 1, I would range from 8 out of 10 to 8.5 out of 10, because it's truly great, and it can be greater. Well, Season 2 is an 8 out of 10, but it can kind of go back down into a 7.5 to 7. Mainly because I do think out of all the episodes, Season 2 has the only couple of episodes where I genuinely just did not like or thought were very underwhelming. Like, it's a very varied season. It does have some highs, but Season 1 didn't really have any lows to me, and that's kind of why it's lesser, which is a shame because I think the episodes that stand out in Season 2 are hilarious. Oh my gosh, and they are so niche in a good way, as in like you never would have expected this to really be the plot or this person to really be doing this. This is a show that truly does a lot, knows what it wants, and for that reason I just couldn't recommend it enough. I will admit I'm not personally familiar with the types of genres this show embodies. In fact, it makes a lot of references to previous media I've never heard of or touched in my life. And the fact that I, as someone who can't really appreciate some of this show's roots and legacy, is able to enjoy this much, I think if you are well versed in media, or more versed than me at least, you're gonna have a greater time with Poker Face than me. Or maybe you'll have a less happy time because you know how all this stuff goes and you'll be jaded. But hey, I like to remain positive on that note. But I've rambled long enough about Poker Face. I believe it is a show worth watching if you can get Peacock. Just make sure you have other shows to watch as well, because I admittedly regretted watching this in a week. So yeah, that's all I have. Just a little quickie review. Like I said, 8 out of 10 in general, and I cannot wait for season 3 if and or when that happens. Have a good one.